What if Yuji had had Yuki's Star Rage technique in Shinjuku? Let's talk about it, but spoilers for any anime onlys. All right, before we dive in, big shout out to Anthony for the question today. Thank you so much for the support. Okay, so if Yuji had had Star Rage instead of blood manipulation, how might the events of Shinjuku have changed? And first, I'm going to give the very simple yet dull and boring answer, which is I don't think anything would have changed because ultimately the driving force behind what happened was narrative and not power scaling, right? So I think you could swap around and give Yuji any curse technique you want under the sun, and things would have still played out the same way. But I know that that wasn't the spirit behind the question. This is more so just a fun hypothetical, so let's dive into it. First of all, what is Star Rage? Well, it's essentially a technique where you can apply virtual mass to yourself and also the Shikigami Garuda to do some crazy things. For example, we see Yuki apply a ton of virtual mass to Garuda and then one-shot one of Kenjaku's special grade cursed spirits. And here's an example of Yuki applying it to herself. And essentially what this technique does is just manipulate the math equation when it comes to calculating the force you are outputting. Instead of the mass that she actually has, she's adding a bunch of virtual mass on top of that. So what's important to remember here is that Yuki's mass is not actually equivalent to the mass that her forces are outputting, at least to a certain point. And here's where it gets a bit confusing. So just as an example, let's say that Yuki wants to strike with the force of 1,000,000 pounds. Well, if she actually weighed 1,000,000 pounds, then her bones and muscles wouldn't have the strength required to move her arm. It would weigh too much. So that's why it's virtual mass. She's getting the benefit of that mass, but without the downsides of actually having to wield it, if that makes sense. But again, only up to a certain density, which means if she goes high enough with the virtual mass, it does actually affect her and like come into reality. And it's this fact that allows her to perform this ultimate technique of creating a black hole. If she goes too high with the virtual mass, things start to collapse in on themselves, and we saw her do this against Kenjaku. Essentially, this is how it works, and this is not a perfect depiction, this is just an example, but assume that this graph represents her virtual mass. 0 means she's not applying any, and 100 means she's reached that critical limit where it's going to manifest into reality and create a black hole. We have no idea where that limit actually is, so we don't know what the upper limit is of her actually adding mass to herself. Can she add 100 pounds? Can she add 2,000,000 pounds? At what point does the black hole appear? Because on paper, this technique is absolutely broken, right? Because you shouldn't have to come anywhere close to approaching the black hole level in order to one-shot somebody with some virtual mass. Because let's just say she puts like 10 tons on this punch, 500 tons even, that would knock his head clean off, right? Any one of her strikes should be able to one-shot anyone in the verse, if you really think about it, without any risk of summoning a black hole. But that's clearly not how it worked because it would have ended the story in one page, right? Gege kind of came up with a really cool concept, but I don't think he like really took it into consideration on the impact it could have had on the story. So he nerfed her, right? Like there's a few strikes that she had against Kenjaku that if her technique really was just virtual mass, should have ended the fight. So there's clearly some actual like bounding on this that I would assume Gege didn't actually think about, but must exist. And it might be based on like the tensile strength of her muscles and bones. Who knows, right? But all of that to say is that Yuji is going to be limited in the very same way that she was. Because, you know, again, Yuji has this technique. Let's just say he makes each strike 1,000,000,000 tons, right? He one-shots everybody. But clearly it doesn't work that way. What I will say, though, is that if there is some hard cap prior to the black hole that's just limited by the strength of your body, then Yuji should be able to use it better than Yuki did because Yuji is built different, quite literally, right? He basically has a heavenly restricted body. Not literally, but we know that his physicals are off the charts. So theoretically, he would be even more potent than Yuki with this. Again, that's under the assumption that there is a hard limit based on your own strength. So if we give Yuji this instead of blood manipulation, I think it makes him even more of a glass cannon because it makes him way more potent in his offensive capabilities because he really didn't even do that much with the blood manipulation. manipulation. But what's important to remember is blood manipulation helped him heal. It really helped him with his RCT. So he might get taken off the battlefield if he didn't have that. But, his strikes, especially if we want to think about some Black Flash Star Rage strikes, are going to be dealing a lot of damage. But again, considering Kenjaku could tank them, then Sukuna definitely could tank them. Really, the most important thing Yuji could have gotten from Yuki, he already did, and that was her soul research, which I'm sure helped him deepen his understanding of the soul and allowed him to excise Megami from Sukuna even more efficiently than he would have been able to. So whether it's blood manipulation or Star Rage, I don't think it changes the events of Shinjuku that much because it was ultimately Yuji's wielding of Shrine combined with his knowledge of the soul that ultimately helps them put him down. But don't get me wrong, this goes incredibly hard.